Now I know for most people, Europe is their number one place to go for vacation. But it wasn't always like this. 1,000 years ago, in fact, Europe was dead last on the list for where anyone wanted to be. So what happened? Like, what changed during the Renaissance? What was Europe like back then? So before we get into the Renaissance, we're going to be discussing what Europe was like by starting with the classical era. Now you have to understand, the Renaissance wasn't celebrating new things. It was mostly emphasizing old ideas of when Europe was once great. And I sound like Trump now. Anyways, now what they meant by old Europe was the Greco-Roman world, or the Greeks and the Romans. So most of you should know that the Greeks are most famous for their culture, the mythology, the architecture, and establishing the foundations of democracy that we still see in our governments and modern governments today. However, what was most important was that most historians believe that the Greeks were the first Europeans or people to settle in Europe. In fact, they believe many of the indigenous people we will later see were descendants or Greek colonists. Now the Greeks are probably most famous for philosophy and their contributions to it. In fact, they are most well known for their philosophers. Just to name a few: Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Pythagoras, just to name a few. And we believe that the Greeks laid the foundations for the modern way of thinking and science. Now there are hundreds of philosophers, and it'll take me decades to explain all of them, but we're going to focus on perhaps one of the most influential, Socrates. Now Socrates was born in Athens, where most true philosophers are born, and he was very famous. In fact, most Athenians said in his time that Socrates brought philosophy to Greece, even though there's already philosophy there. In fact, modern historians name two schools of thought after him: the pre-Socratic philosophy and the Socratic philosophy. Now Socrates is probably most famous for developing his new way of thinking, known as the Socratic method. Now this way of thinking approached arguments in a very rational, very logical way. So two people were having an intelligent argument with each other, not the arguments we see on TV today. These two, one person would bring up questions while the other would try to disprove them. And you had this back and forth while it was all very intellectual as well. And this would form the basis of the scientific method proposed by Sir Francis Bacon, in which we would ask a question, form a hypothesis around it, and then try to prove or disprove it using experiments. So despite being, a really cool guy, who gets two eras named after them, right? Well, it came with a price. He wasn't really liked in Athens. Well, one of them was because he didn't really believe that the gods were the foundations of everything, as he sought rational reasons behind natural occurrences like changes of seasons, changes of weather, etc. Also, he was really arrogant. So this oracle, the Oracle of Delphi, if you ever read Percy Jackson's, the person that tells you what's going to happen in the future and it's going to happen, right? So apparently this oracle said that Socrates is the wisest man of all. And Socrates heard this and he's like, nah, I'm not. But then it got him wondering. So he went around Athens and asked everyone, hey, do you think you're really smart? And of course, everyone who's self-respecting would say, yeah, of course I'm smart, right? And then Socrates used this as a reason. He said, well, if people think they're smart, that just proves how unsmart they are. Not unsmart, stupid they are. And then he would say that to that person, you're a dummy. And of course, people aren't going to laugh that off, especially when you just call them stupid when they said they were smart. And no one really liked Socrates after that. Socrates' legacy lives among his students, one of them being a philosopher I mentioned earlier, Plato, and Plato's student, Aristotle, whom most of you should know for being always wrong. So, whether you love or hate the philosophical discussions that Mr. Reitz gives, you know who to thank. This Greek golden age, or like this thing that I'm painting, how Greek culture was everything, right? It wasn't. Greek history had some bumps along the road, including when the Persian Empire invaded Greece twice. And this unified the Greek city-states to fight a common enemy. Although this was sort of unification, a lot of the city-states weren't very happy that Athens proclaimed themselves as the capital of the new unified Greece. Eventually, a civil war broke out called the Peloponnesian War, in which there was a lot of belligerents, but then we'll focus on two, the Spartans and the Athenians, in which they were both fighting for supremacy over the Greeks. And eventually, the Spartans would win as they surrounded Athens and laid siege to it. And Athens' prestige would be ruined forever. However, why did this even happen? So Alexander the Great was an amazing general, amazing military strategist, but he wasn't a very good empire. How do I say this? He wasn't very good at consolidating his empire. Like 2 seconds after he died, his empire split up between his different generals. However, it wasn't really this that mattered, because he spread Greek culture whether he knew it or not. In fact, we're still seeing evidence in the Middle East of ancient Greek coins. In fact, to prove that he left more of a mark than he intended, or probably knew that he did, he built cities all over the places he conquered. Namely, let's name some. Alexandria, Egypt, Alexandria Oxyana, Alexandria Strate, Alexandria Bucephalus. And this was named after both him and his warhorse. And despite his lack of creativity, Alexander still spread Greek culture all over the lands he conquered. But now, Macedon's time in the spotlight of being an empire was over. It was time for Alexander to pass the baton of empire building to some other people, the Romans. So the city of Rome first had a king, and this city was constantly being bullied by the Etruscans, who were the indigenous people from northern Italy. So Rome got tired of this, and they're like, you know what? New changes. They expelled the king, rose an army, defeated the Etruscans, and unified Italy. And they created a republic based on the democratic ideals of, guess who? The Greeks. So the Roman Republic expanded to North Africa, Egypt, Spain, France, and Greece. Greece is probably one of the most important as it impacted Roman culture the most. As we can see, the way they dress, their art style, and let's be honest, the gods are basically directly ripped off. And most importantly, democracy, as it was the foundation of the Roman Republic. Of course, the Roman Republic didn't last very long. A guy named Julius Caesar, heard of him? He came along, became dictator for life, and screwed the system up. You know how the story goes. Julius Caesar gets assassinated, but Rome ends up turning into an empire anyways. And after this, they expand even more. They expanded to Turkey, they expanded to Britain, they expanded to the Rhineland, they expanded to Dacia, modern Romania, and most importantly, they expanded into Palestine. If you're confused, I'll explain. First off, the Roman Empire is probably one of the biggest influences on the Western world. I mean, just think about it. First of all, democracy. In fact, our own governmental system in the United States is based on the Roman Republic. And then architectural advances. Do you like arches? Do you like domes? They all came from the Romans. And let's think about engineering techniques. Do you like hydraulics? Do you like using pumps in your plumbing system? They all came from the Romans. And the Romans are probably most famous for conquering the barbaric European world and bringing civilization, the first modern professional army, and it provided an example for empires generations to come. Despite all this, all the things they have contributed, the Romans' greatest legacy is perhaps Christianity. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Romans conquered Palestine, and guess who lived in Palestine? Israelites. Now, the Israelites were subjects of many empires, including the Persians, thousands and thousands of years ago, and they were kind of tired. Like the Romans coming in were no exception. By that time, they were not even by the Romans, like when the Persians conquered them, they were already praying to God for a leader who would unify all the Israelites and finally free them from their oppressors. And they called this holy leader the Messiah. Now this is no different from the Roman Empire after these Israelites had been subjugated. Now, once you get to know Rome, they're not that bad. Just get past the looting of the villages, the killings, the slaughtering. Once you get to know the Roman legionaries, they really aren't that bad. And the Roman Empire had a pretty good reputation for accepting other religions, as long as these other religions accepted the emperor as one of their gods. Now obviously this was going to be a problem for the Jews or Israelites because they only believed in one God. And they believed that the emperor of Rome was not worthy of leading. And now they had problems. Because of this, there was a mass persecution of Jews and Israelites within the Roman Empire. And because of this fever for Messiah, or this Messiah mania grew so much as everyone wanted a leader who would rise up and take charge and rid the Israelites of their oppressors. And it became so bad that literally anyone could say they were a Messiah and they would get followers. Jesus Christ from the New Testament, you might know him, was considered one of these messiahs who gathered a considerable following of people. So regardless of Messiah or no Messiah, the Jewish religion would have been completely wiped out if it hasn't been for one person, Paul the Apostle. Now keep in mind, Paul was a Jew, but he had a different opinion, or like a different way of thinking for this religion. First he combined, of course, Judaism, the idea of monotheism, which there's only one God. He combined that with the fact that Jesus was the true Messiah, and he combined it all with Greek philosophy, and he created something new, something we now today know as Christianity. Of course, when these prestigious Israelite Jewish guys saw this, they're like, no, that's not right, you heretic. So then they rejected these beliefs, and of course, this is where the two religions branched off. One being Judaism, the Old Testament, and one being Christianity, the New Testament. Christianity grew really popular in the Roman Empire, and for a couple of reasons. One of them being, if you accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior, you would go to heaven. That's simple. Second of all, it taught some equality between genders, and this was pretty new, so that's why a lot of women also converted. Eventually, the populations of Christians in the Roman Empire got really big that they could be blamed for everything. Like, when Rome was set ablaze, Emperor Nero blamed the Christians for it. And yeah, they were still persecuted, and wouldn't be for a long time until Emperor Constantine took the throne, when the Christians finally caught a break. This is because Emperor Constantine converted the Roman Empire into Christianity, and by doing this, he moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, or modern-day Istanbul. And the wealth, the power, moved from Rome to the east, to Constantinople, because most of the trade with like the Middle Eastern countries, the Arab nations, all were focused on the east, while the west was left to the barbarians. We see the Huns, the Vandals, the Goths descend upon Rome and taking whatever they want because Rome wasn't what it used to be. It was no longer very powerful. And we see Rome, the city of Rome, once the center of civilization, being sacked several times, with the Roman Empire growing weaker every single time. Finally, in 476 AD, the Visigoths put the Western Roman Empire out of its misery by marching into Rome, sacking it one last time, deposed the Western Roman Emperor, and finally the Roman Empire in the West dissolved as Europe descended into anarchy. Now keep in mind the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, still existed with its capital in Byzantium, Constantinople, or Istanbul, whatever you want to call it, and it still flourished. Now, if you're being taught AP European history by Mr. Rosenberg, he'll probably tell you that this thing is not going to be on the test. But regardless, you should know this. This is important because a lot of what happens because of this leads to the Renaissance, which is the main focus of AP European history. So let's go over what we learned today. Today we learned about Greek culture, the Greek philosophies, how the Macedonian Empire came, Alexander the Great and his creative city naming, the Roman Empire, where Christianity came from, and the fall of Rome. Thanks for watching our first episode of Whitney High School AP European History. And next time we're going to be looking at the medieval era. See you next time.